When I pulled up the long gravel drive and saw a minivan in my yard, something in my chest unclenched and then unclenched the wrong way. The porch swing where my grandmother used to sit had a different blanket on it. The mailbox had a neighbor's name I didn't recognize, and a little plastic scooter leaned against the fence like it had always lived there. I stood there for a long minute and tasted dust and diesel and a kind of disbelief that's quieter than anger. Then I walked up to the door and knocked, because that's what you do when your house looks like somebody else's home. They answered like you'd expect strangers to answer. Polite, unsure, two people with sunscreen on the back of their necks, and a toddler on the stair. "We bought it from the association," the woman said, calm as a closed window. "Everything's legal." She smiled the way people smile when they've practiced their lines. Behind her, the living room looked familiar and wrong at the same time. My chipped coffee table, my father's old oil lamp, a picture frame turned face down on the mantel. I felt something sharp and animal inside me, not violence, not then just the small, terrible rawness of being told you don't belong in your own life anymore. They told me to speak with the HOA office. I showed up the next morning, thinking it'd be paperwork, a mistake, a clerical thing fixed with signatures and the right number of forms. The office smelled like old coffee and lemon cleaner. There were framed mission statements on the wall, and behind a neat little desk sat Marjorie Hale. Neat hair, sharper heels, perfectly polite. "We follow our covenants," she said, and when I pushed back she gave me a look like a teacher correcting a student, pity wrapped in authority. When I asked how my property had been sold while I was overseas, she leaned forward, hands steepled, and said, "You were delinquent in assessments and fines. The sale was lawful." It was the sentence you hear in a courtroom before the gavel falls, except there was no judge, only a stack of envelopes and a secretary offering me a seat. I'm not a man who gets rattled easily. I spent a decade on other people's timelines, learned how to breathe through chaos. But this was different. It felt like an erasure, like someone had taken a past that belonged to my family and rewritten it into a ledger entry. I went to the county clerk and learned the transfer was recorded. On paper, it looked clean enough to make any bank nod. But paper is a clever liar. It can hold 1,000 neat lies in fonts and signatures. The numbers didn't add up. Fees were padded. Notices allegedly mailed to me went to an old address my grandparents had used 20 years ago. Someone had used my deployment as a gap and then filled that gap with paperwork that made the law look like a weapon. The middle of the story is always where people decide who they are. Some folks get quiet. Some people hire lawyers. Some people move on because life crushes smaller fights. I started saying the word no to a lot of invitations. I knocked on doors of neighbors I barely knew and listened. Mrs. Eldon, who's lived 2 houses down for 27 years, handed me a folder of notices and a tear that was part anger and part relief. Hank and June had their deed tied up because of fines about trash bins. The Mason family lost their access to a community garden because they missed a hearing they'd never been told about. There was a pattern, fines escalating to liens, liens converted into forced sales, and a small group on the board who seemed to profit from chaos. It wasn't just greed. It was a kind of bureaucratic cruelty that knows how to dress itself in rules and look respectable. I didn't know a lot about law, but I knew people who did. Anna Kepler, lawyer, not the type to sugarcoat things, read the paperwork and said, flat, "This is a racket. There's a pattern, targeted notices, manufactured violations, then sales." She had that look lawyers get when they find a thread and start pulling until the whole sweater comes apart. Anna filed a motion to freeze any more sales and asked for discovery. Once discovery starts, people start sweating. Email chains surface, invoices with handwriting on them, a thumb drive handed over in a parking lot, small acts of bravery that unravel pretense. And then there was Tommy Reed, the kind of man who wears a stew of regret and relief on his face when he confesses to something that hurt more people than he thought. Tommy worked as a clerk for the association for a few years. He told me at a diner booth, voice low, that they'd been told to prioritize properties, which meant properties owned by people often out of town, veterans, the elderly. They said it was just good business, he said, stirring his coffee like he could mix away guilt. Tommy handed over emails that read like a playbook. How to send notices in ways that guarantee they go unanswered, how to bundle fines, how to document hearings that never happened. His hands shook. It's one thing to find a crooked ledger. It's another to watch a real person hand you the matches. There's a moment in every true fight where the scale tips the point where private envy becomes public scandal. Our tipping point was a hearing that packed the little county courtroom, elbows and murmurs, phones up for live video. People who'd been shushed for years found their voices. The judge read the discovery with eyebrows drawn in. Anna laid out the pattern manufactured violations, targeted notices, profits funneled through shell accounts. The room watched Marjorie Hale, who had always been so sure of her neat little world, shrink a fraction under the light. She tried to charm the court, to make it look like policy, like an administrative mistake. But charm can't hold up to a paper trail the color of an accusation. Courtroom scenes don't come with music, they come with the real sounds. The scratch of pens, the intake of breath, the rustle of a folder that holds your future. Witnesses testified: neighbors, a county clerk, Tommy with his thumb drive, and when the judge finally asked Marjorie to speak, her voice had that practiced calm. She said they followed the rules. She said they served notice. She said, in a way that was meant to be lesson-like, that the law had been applied. But application and justice are not the same thing. Justice considers context. Justice asks why a group of people were prioritized for fines and why those fines so often landed on those who couldn't fight back. There was a scene after the judge's ruling that I'll never forget. The sales that were tied to the fraudulent practices were voided. Judges don't always do the morally right thing, but sometimes they do the legally right one that also happens to be right. People hugged in the hallway like loosed animals. The family who'd been living in my living room packed up that night and left quietly. The woman looked at me at the truck and said, "I didn't know." I wanted to shout that ignorance is a poor excuse, but she looked tired in the way people look after being folded into someone else's story. Tommy got a deal for testifying. Marjorie was referred for further investigation. The board members who'd allowed the pattern to continue were forced into uncomfortable press. It wasn't a movie triumph. It was paperwork and consequences and a judge who did what the law asked. After, there was a kind of quiet that wasn't exactly peace. The porch swing needed sanding. My father's old lamp needed rewiring. I sat on the porch at dusk and thought about what had happened, not because I loved the drama of it, but because it showed me something about people and power. Institutions, whether they're homeowners associations or small-town committees, are collections of people, and sometimes those people make choices that hollow out the place they claim to protect. Other times, those institutions are ways for a few to hide thievery behind bylaws and minutes. The work of repairing that damage is always quieter than the fight. It's teaching neighbors how notices should actually be served. It's adding transparency. It's making sure the county clerk has oversight. It's checking on people who are often out of town. The story doesn't end with me on a fixed porch. Endings like that feel dishonest. There are still hearings, appeals humming like distant wasps, and there are neighbors who won't trust the HOA again, and why should they? Trust is not given, it's earned. But there's also a sweetness in neighbors showing up with tools, hauling off broken lattice, bringing pie. So we fought, and we won enough to breathe. And now the work is to make sure the next person doesn't have to fight at all. If this story hits a nerve, if you've seen the same kind of small-scale, well-dressed cruelty, share it. Tell what happened in your town, in your block, in your association. Talk about what justice should look like and what it really looks like. If you think the system failed here, say how you change it. If you think people should be held accountable, say who and why. Leave a comment. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you're living with an HOA that makes rules feel like weapons, tell somebody, because community is the only thing that keeps private power from becoming a private theft.